She was the billionaire's untouched internship, until he risked everything for one of her smiles. She knew this moment would change everything, but she walked through those glass doors anyway. Madison Parker adjusted the strap of her worn leather briefcase, her pearl green eyes scanning the towering lobby of Sterling Holdings. The marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than her entire college tuition. At 24, she had dreamed of this moment, stepping into one of Manhattan's most exclusive corporate empires, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer magnitude of wealth surrounding her. "You must be the new intern," said a crisp voice behind her. Madison turned to find a woman in her 40s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "I'm Vivian Cross, executive assistant to Mr. Kane. Follow me." As they walked toward the elevators, Madison's natural blonde hair caught the afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. She had inherited her mother's gentle beauty and her father's sharp mind, a combination that had served her well in small-town Ohio. But here in New York, she wondered if it would be enough. "Some ground rules," Vivian said as the elevator climbed silently toward the 45th floor. "Mr. Kane values precision, punctuality, and professionalism above all else. He doesn't engage in small talk. He doesn't tolerate mistakes. And he absolutely never—" She paused, her eyes meeting Madison's in the polished steel reflection. "Mixes business with personal matters." Madison nodded, her hands slightly trembling as she clutched her notepad. "Understood." The elevator doors opened to reveal a world of glass and steel that seemed to float above the city. Madison's breath caught in her throat. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Central Park spread out like a green oasis surrounded by the urban jungle of Manhattan. "Mr. Kane will see you briefly for an introduction," Vivian continued, leading her down a corridor lined with abstract sculptures that probably belonged in museums. "He's reviewing the quarterly reports, so keep it short." They stopped before massive oak doors that seemed to guard secrets worth billions. Vivian knocked twice, a sound that echoed like a heartbeat. "Come in." The voice was deep, commanding, and sent an unexpected shiver down Madison's spine. Vivian opened the doors, and Madison stepped into what could only be described as a temple to success. The office was vast, dominated by a glass desk that reflected the city skyline. Behind it sat a man who seemed to embody power itself. Alexander Kane was not what she had expected. At 37, he possessed the kind of presence that filled a room without effort. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass, and his gray eyes held an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through her carefully constructed composure. He didn't look up immediately. Instead, he finished writing something with a fountain pen that probably cost more than her monthly rent, his movements precise and deliberate. When he finally raised his eyes to meet hers, Madison felt the world pause. "Madison Parker," he said. Not a question, but a statement. His voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Yes, sir," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Thank you for this opportunity. I know how competitive this internship is, and I won't disappoint you." For a moment, just a moment, something flickered across his expression. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but Madison caught it, a softening around his eyes as if her simple gratitude had caught him off guard. "Your professors speak highly of your analytical skills," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Economics, correct?" "Yes, sir. I'm particularly interested in urban development and sustainable hospitality practices." She straightened her shoulders, drawing on every ounce of confidence she'd built during 4 years of proving herself. "I've studied Sterling Holdings' recent expansion into eco-luxury resorts, and I believe there are untapped opportunities in—" "That's enough." He held up a hand, but his tone wasn't harsh. If anything, it seemed amused. "Vivian will show you to your workspace. You'll be assisting with the Los Angeles project analysis." Madison felt heat rise to her cheeks. Had she overstepped? In her eagerness to impress, had she already violated some unspoken rule? "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize for having opinions, Miss Parker." Alexander stood, and Madison realized he was taller than she'd imagined, his presence even more commanding when he wasn't seated behind the massive desk. "Just make sure they're informed ones." As she turned to leave, something made her pause at the doorway. Maybe it was the way the afternoon light caught the city beyond his windows, or maybe it was the realization that she was actually here, in this impossible place, about to begin the internship she'd worked so hard to earn. She looked back over her shoulder and offered him the smallest of smiles. Not calculated or flirtatious, just genuine gratitude mixed with quiet determination. "Thank you, Mr. Kane. I won't let you down." And in that moment something shifted in Alexander Kane's perfectly controlled world. It was subtle, like the first crack in a dam, but he felt it nonetheless. The smile she'd given him wasn't trying to charm or manipulate. It was simply real. For a man who had built an empire on reading people's motives and exploiting their weaknesses, Madison Parker's transparent sincerity hit him like a revelation. As the oak doors closed behind her, Alexander found himself staring at the spot where she'd stood, his mind replaying that smile. In his 37 years, he had built walls around himself that no one had ever managed to breach. He had rules, ironclad, non-negotiable rules, that had kept him focused and successful. But something told him that the young woman with pearl-green eyes and an innocent smile was about to test every single one of them. He returned to his desk, picked up his fountain pen and tried to focus on the quarterly reports. But the numbers seemed to blur together, and all he could think about was the way Madison Parker had looked at him, not with the calculation he was used to from employees seeking advancement, but with something far more dangerous: trust. And for the first time in years, Alexander Kane felt something inside his chest that had nothing to do with business, nothing to do with profit margins or market dominance. It felt suspiciously like interest, and that terrified him more than any hostile takeover ever could. 3 days later, Madison discovered that working for a billionaire meant learning to read silence like a second language. Her workspace was a glass cubicle on the 43rd floor, positioned strategically where she could observe the constant flow of executives, analysts, and consultants who moved through Sterling Holdings like pieces on Alexander Kane's personal chessboard. She had quickly learned that everyone here spoke in coded language. Budget allocations meant territorial wars. Efficiency reviews meant someone was about to lose their job. And when Alexander Kane requested to discuss something, grown men in $1,000 suits suddenly found urgent reasons to check their phones. Madison kept her head down and her observations to herself. She arrived at 7:30 each morning, 30 minutes before anyone else, and spent those precious moments reviewing the Los Angeles project files she'd been assigned. The development was ambitious, a chain of eco-luxury resorts that would redefine sustainable hospitality on the West Coast. The numbers were staggering, but something about the projected environmental impact assessments didn't quite add up. "Parker." The deep voice made her look up from her laptop. Alexander Kane stood beside her cubicle, and Madison's heart performed an unexpected somersault. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her car, his dark hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. But it was his eyes, those penetrating gray eyes, that made her forget how to breathe properly. "Yes, Mr. Kane." She managed to keep her voice steady, professional. "Conference room C, 5 minutes." He turned to walk away, then paused. "Bring the LA projections." Madison watched him disappear around the corner, her pulse racing for reasons that had nothing to do with professional anxiety. She gathered her files with hands that trembled slightly, annoyed with herself for the reaction. This was exactly what she couldn't afford, getting distracted by her impossibly attractive boss who probably didn't even remember her first name half the time. Conference room C was a study in understated luxury, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River and a polished table that could seat 20. When Madison arrived, Alexander was standing with his back to the door, his silhouette framed against the morning sky. "Close the door," he said without turning around. Madison's stomach fluttered as she complied, the soft click of the latch seeming unusually loud in the quiet room. When Alexander finally turned to face her, she was struck again by the intensity of his presence. He moved with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the world, yet there was something in his expression she couldn't quite read. "You've been reviewing the Los Angeles projections," he said, settling into a chair across from her. "What do you think?" Madison opened her folder, grateful to have something concrete to focus on. "The financial models are impressive, and the market research supports the demand for luxury eco-resorts. But," she hesitated, suddenly aware that she was about to critique a multi-billion-dollar project to the man who probably conceived it. "But?" His tone was neutral, giving nothing away. "The environmental impact assessments seem optimistic," she said carefully. "The projected carbon offset numbers don't account for the construction phase emissions, and some of the sustainable technology implementations might be more theoretical than practical at this scale." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his gray eyes never leaving her face. The silence stretched between them, and Madison wondered if she had just talked herself out of her internship. But then, something unexpected happened. He smiled. Not the polished corporate smile she'd seen him use with executives and board members, but something genuine and almost proud. "Most people tell me what they think I want to hear," he said quietly. "You just told me the truth, even when it might cost you." Madison felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm sorry if I overstepped." "Don't apologize." His voice was firm but not unkind. "You're right about the assessments. I've had the same concerns, but the development team keeps assuring me the numbers work." He paused, studying her with an intensity that made her skin tingle. "I want you to take another look at the entire project. Not as an intern, but as a consultant. Give me a complete analysis with your recommendations." Madison's eyes widened. "Mr. Kane, I'm just a student. I don't have the experience to—" "You have something more valuable than experience," he interrupted. "You have clarity. You see things without the filter of corporate politics or personal agendas." He stood, moving to the window, and Madison found herself studying the strong line of his shoulders beneath his tailored jacket. "The Los Angeles project represents a significant investment. If we move forward with flawed assumptions, it could cost us hundreds of millions. You're trusting me with that level of responsibility?" Madison couldn't hide her amazement. Alexander turned back to face her, and for a moment the professional mask slipped. She saw something vulnerable in his expression, something almost lonely. "I'm trusting you with more than you know," he said softly. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning Madison didn't dare interpret. She felt her carefully constructed professional composure wavering under the weight of his gaze. There was something happening here, something that went beyond quarterly reports and environmental assessments, and it terrified her. "I won't disappoint you," she managed to say, the words coming out slightly breathless. "I know you won't." Alexander moved toward the door but paused with his hand on the handle. "Madison?" The sound of her first name on his lips sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "Yes, the analysis. I want your honest opinion. Not what you think Sterling Holdings wants to hear, not what you think will advance your career. Your truth." His gray eyes held hers with an intensity that made her feel exposed and seen all at once. "Can you do that for me?" Madison nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. As Alexander left the conference room, she remained seated at the polished table, her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird. For the first time since arriving at Sterling Holdings, she wondered if she was in over her head, not because of the work, but because of the man who had just entrusted her with his empire's future. And the way he had said her name suggested he was wondering the same thing about himself. Back in his office, Alexander Kane stood at his window, his reflection ghost-like against the Manhattan skyline. He had built his fortune on calculated risks and cold logic, but something about Madison Parker defied every rule he had learned about human nature. She was brilliant, that much was clear, but more than that, she was genuine in a world where authenticity was rarer than platinum. When she looked at him, she didn't see dollar signs or opportunities for advancement. She saw him, and that realization was more dangerous than any corporate merger he had ever navigated. Because for the first time in his adult life, Alexander Kane was beginning to question his most fundamental rule: never let anyone get close enough to matter. Madison had always been a creature of routine, but Alexander Kane was slowly unraveling every carefully constructed habit she'd built. It started with the coffee. For 2 weeks, she had arrived at Sterling Holdings at 7:30 sharp, stopped by the small cafe on the 35th floor, ordered the same medium dark roast with a splash of cream, and settled into her cubicle to review files before the corporate storm began. But this morning, when she approached the barista, a kind woman named Dolores who always remembered her order, there was already a steaming cup waiting. "From the gentleman in the corner," Dolores said with a knowing smile, nodding toward a table by the windows. Madison's heart stopped. Alexander Kane sat alone, reading what appeared to be the Wall Street Journal, a matching coffee cup beside his folded hands. He was dressed more casually than usual, no tie, his shirt collar open at the throat, and the morning light streaming through the windows softened the sharp edges that made him so intimidating in the boardroom. When he looked up and caught her staring, Madison felt heat flood her cheeks. He gestured to the empty chair across from him, with the same quiet authority he used to command million-dollar meetings. "Thank you for the coffee," she said as she approached, her voice carefully neutral despite the way her pulse was racing. "You looked like you needed it yesterday," he replied, folding his newspaper with precise movements. "Long night working on the analysis?" Madison settled into the chair, acutely aware of how the morning light seemed to make his gray eyes appear almost silver. I wanted to be thorough. The environmental impact calculations are more complex than I initially thought. And your conclusions? She took a sip of the coffee, perfectly prepared exactly how she liked it, and wondered how he had managed to notice such a small detail about her preferences. The project can work, but not as currently designed. We'd need to restructure the construction timeline, implement different sustainable technologies, and probably reduce the initial scale by about 30%. Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying her with that intense focus that made her feel as though she were the only person in the world. That would reduce projected profits significantly. In the short term, yes, but it would ensure long-term sustainability, both environmental and financial. The alternative is risking regulatory challenges, environmental lawsuits, and potential project delays that could cost far more than the initial reduction in scope. For a long moment, he said nothing. Madison found herself cataloging details about him that had nothing to do with business. The way his dark hair had a slight wave that his styling couldn't quite tame, the small scar above his left eyebrow that suggested a childhood accident, the way his fingers drummed silently against his coffee cup when he was thinking. You realize you're essentially telling me to spend less money to make less money, he said finally. But there was something that sounded almost like admiration in his voice. I'm telling you to build something that will last, Madison replied, surprised by her own boldness. Isn't that what Sterling Holdings is supposed to represent? Legacy? Something shifted in Alexander's expression, a crack in the professional armor he wore so naturally. Most people in your position would tell me what they thought I wanted to hear. Find ways to make the numbers work, regardless of the reality. I'm not most people. No, he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made her breath catch. You're not. The silence that followed was charged with something Madison didn't dare name. She was saved from having to respond by the arrival of Vivian Cross, who appeared beside their table with the supernatural timing that made her such an effective executive assistant. Mr. Kane, the board meeting has been moved up to 9:30, Vivian announced, her sharp eyes taking in the intimate coffee scene with barely concealed curiosity. And Miss Parker, Mr. Hendricks from legal, needs to see you about some questions on your background check. Madison felt her stomach drop. Background check. Standard procedure for anyone working on high-level projects, Alexander said smoothly, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes. Nothing to worry about. As they walked toward the elevators together, Madison couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The easy moment they'd shared over coffee suddenly felt fragile, overshadowed by the reminder of just how different their worlds really were. Madison, Alexander said as they reached her floor, his hand briefly touching her elbow to stop her from stepping off the elevator. The contact sent electricity shooting up her arm. Whatever Hendricks asks you, just be honest. The same honesty you've shown me. She nodded, struck by the concern in his voice. As the elevator doors closed between them, she realized she was in serious trouble, not because of any background check, but because she was falling for a man who lived in a world she could barely comprehend. The legal department occupied half of the 40th floor, all glass offices and mahogany furniture that whispered of power and money. Jefferson Hendricks was a man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of sharp suit that suggested he charged by the minute. When Madison entered his office, he was reviewing a thick file that she assumed contained every detail of her life since birth. Miss Parker, please sit. His smile was polite but calculating. This is just a routine interview. Standard questions for anyone working on sensitive projects. But the questions weren't standard at all. He asked about her family's financial history, her college loans, her dating life, whether she had any connections to competitors or journalists. Each inquiry felt like a subtle probe, searching for weaknesses or vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Have you ever been involved in any romantic relationships with employers or supervisors? Hendricks asked, his pen poised over a legal pad. Madison felt her cheeks burn. No. Any current romantic interest within Sterling Holdings? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Madison thought about the coffee that morning, about the way Alexander had looked at her, about the electricity she felt every time he said her name. No, she repeated, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. Hendricks made a note, then closed the file. That's all for now, Miss Parker. You can return to your work. As Madison left his office, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just been warned, subtly but unmistakably, about the dangers of getting too close to Alexander Kane. Later that afternoon, she was deep in calculations when a shadow fell across her desk. She looked up to find Alexander standing there, his expression unreadable. "How did it go with Hendricks?" he asked quietly. "Fine," Madison replied, though they both knew it was anything but fine. Alexander glanced around the open office space, then made a decision that surprised them both. "Walk with me." They rode the elevator to the roof in silence, emerging onto a private garden that Madison hadn't known existed. The wind whipped her blonde hair around her face as she took in the stunning view of Manhattan, spreading out in all directions. "I need you to know," Alexander said, his voice barely audible over the wind, "that whatever happens, whatever they tell you about the rules or the risks, this isn't a game to me." Madison turned to face him, her heart pounding. What isn't a game? For a moment she thought he might actually answer, but then his professional mask slipped back into place, and the moment was lost. "The LA project," he said finally. "Your analysis matters. Don't let them intimidate you into changing your recommendations." As they rode back down to her floor, Madison realized that Alexander Kane had just told her everything, and nothing at all, and somehow, that made her want him even more. The storm broke on a Thursday afternoon when Madison discovered that being right could be the most dangerous thing of all. She had spent 3 weeks perfecting her analysis of the Los Angeles project, working late into the evenings until the Sterling Holdings building emptied and the city lights twinkled like stars beyond her cubicle windows. Her revised projections were thorough, conservative, and absolutely devastating to the original profit margins. Every calculation had been checked and rechecked, every environmental regulation researched and cross-referenced. What she hadn't expected was for her recommendations to land her in the middle of a corporate war. "This is unacceptable," came the sharp voice of Bryce Thornfield, Sterling Holdings' Senior Vice President of Development. Madison looked up from her computer to find him looming over her desk, her printed analysis clutched in his manicured fingers like evidence of a crime. Who authorized an intern to completely redesign a billion-dollar project? Madison's mouth went dry. Bryce was everything she had imagined a corporate shark would be, perfectly groomed, expensively dressed, and radiating the kind of casual cruelty that came from wielding power over people's careers. Behind him stood 2 other executives she recognized but had never spoken to, their expressions ranging from amused to predatory. "Mr. Kane asked me to review the environmental assessments," Madison said carefully, rising from her chair. Even standing, she had to look up to meet Bryce's cold blue eyes. "Mr. Kane," Bryce repeated with a smirk that made Madison's skin crawl. "And exactly what qualifications does a little girl from Ohio have to question projections prepared by teams of experts with decades of experience?" The condescension in his voice was designed to humiliate, and Madison felt heat rise to her cheeks. Around the office, conversations had stopped as colleagues turned to watch the confrontation. She was acutely aware of being on display, of being tested in front of people who would determine whether she had a future in this industry. "The qualifications of someone who isn't afraid to tell the truth," she replied quietly, proud that her voice remained steady. Bryce's smile turned razor sharp. "The truth? The truth is that you're a temporary employee who doesn't understand how business works in the real world. These projections would cost us hundreds of millions in lost revenue." "Thornfield." The single word cut through the tension like a blade. Madison turned to see Alexander Kane approaching, his expression controlled but dangerous. The executives behind Bryce suddenly found reasons to check their phones and drift away, but Bryce held his ground with the confidence of someone who had never been truly challenged. "Alexander," Bryce said smoothly, his tone shifting to something that might have been respect if it hadn't been so obviously calculated. "I was just explaining to your intern that her little project here could seriously damage the LA development timeline." Alexander's gray eyes flicked to Madison, and for a moment she saw something there that made her pulse quicken, not just concern, but something protective and fierce. "Miss Parker's analysis was requested by me. Her findings will be presented to the board as written." "You can't be serious," Bryce said, his polished composure cracking slightly. "We've invested 2 years of planning into a project that could result in regulatory disasters and environmental lawsuits." Alexander interrupted coldly. "Unless you'd prefer to explain to our shareholders why we ignored obvious risks for the sake of quarterly profits." The silence that followed was electric. Madison watched the 2 men face each other, understanding that she was witnessing more than a disagreement about environmental assessments. This was about power, about territory, about the very soul of Sterling Holdings. "Of course," Bryce said finally, his smile returning but lacking its earlier warmth. "I'm sure the board will find Miss Parker's insights very educational." He turned to leave, then paused. Though I do hope she understands the level of responsibility that comes with such influence. Mistakes at this level can be career-ending. The threat was barely veiled, and Madison felt a chill run down her spine. After Bryce and his entourage departed, she found herself alone with Alexander in the suddenly quiet office space. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, moving closer to her desk. Madison nodded, though her hands were trembling slightly as she gathered her scattered papers. "I didn't mean to cause problems. Maybe I should revise the analysis, find a middle ground." "No." Alexander's voice was firm. "You gave me exactly what I asked for, your honest assessment. Don't let Thornfield intimidate you into compromising your integrity. But if I'm wrong, you're not wrong." Alexander glanced around the office, noting the curious glances from remaining employees. "Come with me." They rode the elevator to his office in silence, the tension from the confrontation still crackling between them. Once the oak doors closed behind them, Alexander moved to his window, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at the Manhattan skyline. "Thornfield has been pushing for this project since before you arrived," he said without turning around. "He's invested significant political capital in making it his success story. And I just made that impossible," Madison said quietly. "You exposed the flaws in his plan before we committed resources we couldn't afford to lose." Alexander turned to face her, his expression serious. "But you need to understand something, Madison. In this business, being right isn't always enough. You need to be prepared for the consequences." Madison studied his face, searching for clues about what he really meant. "What kind of consequences?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made her breath catch. "The kind that could hurt you, and I won't let that happen." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond corporate politics. Madison felt her carefully maintained professional boundaries beginning to crumble under the intensity of his gaze. "Why?" she whispered. "Why does it matter to you what happens to me?" Alexander moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and understated that seemed to embody everything sophisticated about his world. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because somewhere between your first day and this moment you stopped being just an intern." His gray eyes searched her face as if memorizing every detail. "And that scares me more than any business decision I've ever made." Madison's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. The space between them seemed charged with electricity, and she found herself leaning slightly forward, drawn by a force she didn't fully understand. The moment was shattered by a sharp knock on the office doors. Alexander stepped back immediately, his professional mask sliding into place with practiced ease. "Come in," he called. Vivian Cross entered, her expression carefully neutral but her sharp eyes missing nothing about the tension in the room. "Mr. Kane, the board meeting has been scheduled for tomorrow at 2 o'clock. They want to review the Los Angeles projections." "Thank you, Vivian." Alexander's voice was perfectly controlled, giving nothing away about what had just passed between them. After Vivian left, Madison gathered her things in silence, acutely aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. As she reached the door, Alexander's voice stopped her. "Madison?" She turned back, her hand on the brass handle. "Tomorrow, when you present to the board, remember that you belong in that room just as much as anyone else. Don't let them make you feel otherwise." As Madison left his office, she realized that Alexander Kane had just given her something more valuable than career advice. He had given her his faith, and she was terrified that she was about to fall completely and irrevocably in love with a man whose world could destroy her with a single wrong move. The boardroom on the 46th floor was designed to intimidate, and it was working perfectly. Madison sat at the far end of a mahogany table that seemed to stretch for miles, surrounded by 15 of the most powerful people in Manhattan's real estate empire. Each board member represented decades of experience, billions in assets, and the kind of influence that could make or break careers with a single vote. And they were all staring at her. "Miss Parker," said Harrison Whitmore, Sterling Holdings chairman of the board, his silver mustache twitching as he reviewed her analysis. "These are quite ambitious revisions you're proposing." Madison's hands were folded in her lap to hide their trembling, but her voice remained steady. "The revisions are necessary to ensure long-term viability, sir. The environmental regulations alone." "Environmental regulations," interrupted board member Constance Reed with a dismissive wave of her manicured hand. "We have lawyers for that. What we need are profits." From his position at the head of the table, Alexander Kane watched the proceedings with the stillness of a predator. Madison could feel his presence like a steady anchor in the storm of hostile questions, but she knew this battle was hers to fight. "With respect, Mrs. Reed," Madison said, straightening her shoulders, "lawsuits and regulatory delays cost far more than preventive modifications. The Coastal Protection Act alone could result in fines that would eliminate profits for the first 3 years of operation." Bryce Thornfield leaned forward, his smile sharp as broken glass. "Miss Parker seems to be suggesting we scrap 2 years of planning based on her. What? 3 weeks of research? I'm suggesting we modify the planning to reflect reality rather than wishful thinking," Madison replied, surprised by her own boldness. A murmur ran around the table, some approving, others clearly offended by an intern's audacity. Madison caught Alexander's eye for just a moment and saw something there that looked like pride. "The girl has a point," said board member Raymond Cross, Vivian's father and a man whose opinion carried significant weight. "I've seen too many projects fail because we ignored inconvenient truths in favor of optimistic projections." "The projections were prepared by our best analysts," Bryce insisted, his composure beginning to crack. "And Miss Parker's analysis was requested by me," Alexander said quietly, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. His voice carried the kind of authority that ended arguments. "Her findings are thorough, well-researched, and consistent with independent environmental assessments we've commissioned." Madison felt a flutter of surprise. Independent assessments? He had been investigating the project's weaknesses long before asking for her analysis. Chairman Whitmore cleared his throat. "Miss Parker, walk us through your alternative timeline. For the next 20 minutes, Madison presented her revised projections with a confidence that surprised even herself. She explained how staggered construction phases would reduce environmental impact, how modified sustainable technologies would actually improve long-term profitability, and how strategic partnerships with environmental groups could turn potential opposition into valuable marketing alliances. When she finished, the room fell silent. Madison's heart pounded as she waited for their verdict, acutely aware that her entire future in this industry hung in the balance. "Impressive," said board member Catherine Vale finally, "though I wonder, Miss Parker, how someone so young developed such sophisticated insights into our industry." There was something in the woman's tone that made Madison's skin prickle, a suggestion that her analysis might not be entirely her own work. "I've studied Sterling Holdings' previous projects extensively," Madison replied carefully, "and I've always believed that thorough research is more valuable than assumptions based on experience." "How refreshingly naive," Constance Reed murmured. Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but before he could respond, Chairman Whitmore called for a vote. "All in favor of adopting Miss Parker's modified timeline and environmental protocols?" Madison held her breath as hands rose around the table. 7 votes in favor, then 8, 9. When the count finished, 10 board members had voted to adopt her recommendations. Only 5, led by Bryce Thornfield, had opposed. "Motion carries," Whitmore announced. "Miss Parker, congratulations. You've just saved Sterling Holdings approximately $300 million in potential losses." As the board members filed out, Madison remained seated, stunned by what had just happened. She had not only survived the corporate Shark Tank, she had won. "Quite a performance," Bryce Thornfield said as he passed behind her chair, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "But don't think this is over. Girls who play in the big leagues sometimes get hurt." The threat sent ice through Madison's veins, but before she could respond, Alexander appeared beside her chair. "Thornfield," he said quietly, his voice carrying a warning that made the other man stop in his tracks. "I trust you'll be fully supportive of the board's decision going forward." Bryce's smile was cold, but he nodded. "Of course, though I do hope Miss Parker understands that success at this level comes with expectations." After he left, Alexander turned to Madison, his gray eyes searching her face. "Are you all right?" Madison nodded, though she was still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. "I can't believe they actually listened to me." "They listened because you were right," Alexander said, moving closer. "And because you presented your case with the kind of confidence that demands respect." They were alone in the boardroom now, the afternoon sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows and casting long shadows across the polished table. Madison found herself staring at Alexander, trying to understand the expression on his face. "You already knew," she said suddenly, "about the environmental issues. You had commissioned other assessments." Alexander's smile was slight but genuine. "I suspected, but I needed someone without a vested interest in the original projections to confirm my concerns. So I was a test? You were... Alexander paused, as if searching for the right words. You were the person I trusted to tell me the truth, regardless of the consequences. The word trusted hung between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond business. Madison felt her carefully maintained professional boundaries crumbling under the weight of his gaze. Alexander, she whispered, using his first name without thinking. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his gray eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. You have no idea what you've done to me, he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. What you continue to do to me every time you walk into a room. Madison's breath caught. They were standing in the heart of his corporate empire, surrounded by the trappings of his success, and he was looking at her as if she were the only thing that mattered. I should go, she managed to say, though every fiber of her being wanted to stay. Yes, Alexander agreed, but neither of them moved. The space between them seemed to crackle with electricity, and Madison realized that they were standing at the edge of a precipice. One more step, one more word, and there would be no going back to the safe boundaries of boss and intern. Alexander's hand lifted slightly, as if he was going to touch her face, but then he caught himself and stepped back. You should go, he said, his voice carefully controlled, before I do something that breaks every rule I've ever made. As Madison left the boardroom, her heart pounding and her hands shaking, she realized that Alexander Kane had just told her he was falling as hard and as fast as she was, and that terrified her more than any boardroom full of corporate sharks ever could. Madison discovered that victory in the corporate world came with a price she hadn't expected to pay. The morning after the board meeting, she arrived at Sterling Holdings to find her cubicle had been moved, upgraded to a private office on the 44th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows, and a view of Central Park that took her breath away. A nameplate on the door read Madison Parker, Environmental Consultant, and sitting on her new mahogany desk was a single white orchid in an elegant crystal vase. There was no note, but Madison didn't need one. She recognized Alexander's touch in the understated elegance, in the way he had honored her success without drawing unwanted attention to their connection. What she hadn't anticipated was how her sudden elevation would change everything else. Well, well, came a familiar voice from her doorway. Madison looked up to see Iris Montgomery, a senior analyst who had barely acknowledged her existence during her first month at Sterling Holdings. Now Iris stood in the doorway with the kind of calculating smile that Madison was learning to recognize as dangerous. Looks like someone made quite an impression. Just trying to do good work? Madison replied carefully, though she could hear the defensive edge in her own voice. Oh, I'm sure that's all it was, Iris said, stepping into the office and closing the door behind her. Though I have to say, moving from intern to consultant in less than 6 weeks is quite remarkable. Some people might wonder what kind of extra effort was involved. The implication hit Madison like a physical blow. If you have something to say, Iris, just say it. I'm just observing that Alexander Kane has never shown such personal interest in an intern's career before. Iris examined her manicured nails with studied casualness. Of course, you are quite pretty. And young. Some men find that inspiring. Madison felt heat rise to her cheeks, but before she could respond, Iris continued. Word of advice, sweetie. In this business, reputation is everything. And once people start talking, she shrugged elegantly. Well, it becomes very difficult to be taken seriously for your actual abilities. After Iris left, Madison sat alone in her beautiful new office, staring at the white orchid and feeling the weight of what she had just learned. Her success wasn't being attributed to her analysis or her insight. It was being reduced to the oldest stereotype in corporate America. She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice Alexander approaching until he knocked softly on her open door. May I come in? He asked, and something in his tone told her he had already heard about the rumors. Madison nodded, watching as he closed the door and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in the gesture she had come to recognize as his way of controlling strong emotions. I wanted to apologize, he said without turning around. For what? For putting you in this position. For not anticipating how others would interpret your promotion. Alexander finally faced her, his gray eyes dark with something that looked like regret. I wanted to honor your achievement, but instead I've made your life more difficult. Madison stood, moving closer to him, despite every instinct telling her to maintain professional distance. You didn't do anything wrong. I earned that promotion. I know you did. But in this world, Perception often matters more than reality. Alexander's jaw tightened. And the perception is that you received special treatment because I'm sleeping with you, Madison finished quietly. The words hung in the air between them, stark and ugly and completely false, yet somehow charged with the tension of everything they hadn't done, everything they had carefully avoided. Yes, Alexander said simply. Madison felt something crack inside her chest. So what do we do now? Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. We maintain absolute professionalism. No more private meetings unless Vivian is present. No more conversations that aren't directly related to work. We give them nothing to feed the rumors. And if that's not enough, then Alexander turned back to the window, and Madison could see the tension in his shoulders. Then you might need to consider transferring to another department or another company entirely. The suggestion hit Madison like a slap. You're asking me to leave? I'm trying to protect your career, Alexander said fiercely, turning back to face her. Do you think I want this? Do you think I want to pretend that you don't matter to me? That every time you walk into a room, every time you smile, every time you challenge me with that brilliant mind of yours, it doesn't completely unravel my self-control? Madison's breath caught at the raw emotion in his voice. Alexander, but I won't let my feelings destroy your future, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. You have too much talent, too much potential to let office politics and gossip define your career. They stood facing each other across her new office, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows between them. Madison felt tears prick at her eyes, not just from frustration but from the devastating realization that caring about each other might be the very thing that would tear them apart. What if I don't want to transfer? She asked quietly. What if I'm willing to fight the rumors and prove myself regardless of what people think? Alexander's smile was sad and proud all at once. Then you're braver than I deserve. A soft knock on the door interrupted them, and Vivian Cross entered with her usual impeccable timing. Mr. Kane, your 4 o'clock is here, she announced, her sharp eyes taking in the tension between them with her characteristic discretion. And Miss Parker, the environmental compliance team wants to schedule a meeting about implementing your recommendations. As Alexander prepared to leave, he paused at the door. Madison, whatever you decide, know that I have complete faith in your abilities. You don't need anyone's protection, especially mine. After he left, Madison sank into her new leather chair, staring at the white orchid and trying to process the impossible situation she found herself in. She had worked her entire life for an opportunity like this, had sacrificed relationships and social life and financial security to get here. But now, she was discovering that success in Alexander Kane's world came with rules she had never learned to navigate. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Enjoying your new office? Some gifts come with strings attached. Be careful who you trust. A friend. Madison's blood turned to ice as she read the message. Someone was watching her, documenting her interactions with Alexander, building a case against her credibility. She looked at the white orchid again, beautiful, elegant, and suddenly feeling like evidence of a crime she hadn't committed. But as she sat in her new office with its stunning view of Central Park, Madison realized something that surprised her. She wasn't ready to run. Not from the rumors, not from the politics, and not from whatever was happening between her and Alexander Kane. She had come too far to let fear make her decisions now, even if it meant fighting a battle she wasn't sure she could win. The attack came on a rainy Thursday evening when Madison thought she was finally winning the war. For 2 weeks, she had thrown herself into her work with the kind of focused intensity that made even her harshest critics take notice. The Los Angeles project implementation was proceeding ahead of schedule, environmental partnerships were forming exactly as she had projected, and 3 major industry publications had requested interviews about Sterling Holdings' innovative approach to sustainable luxury development. Madison had just finished reviewing the latest compliance reports when her computer screen flickered and died. At first, she assumed it was a simple technical glitch, until she tried to log back in and discovered that her access to the Sterling Holdings network had been completely revoked. There seems to be some confusion with your security clearance, explained Trevor Walsh from IT, his nervous expression telling Madison this was anything but routine. I'm sure it's just a paperwork error, but until you sort it out, I can't access any of my files. Madison finished, her stomach sinking as she realized the implications. How long will this take? Trevor shifted uncomfortably. That's not really up to me. You'll need to speak with human resources. The Human Resources Department occupied a sterile corner of the 39th floor, all beige carpet and motivational posters that felt more threatening than inspiring. Patricia Fleming, the HR director, was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "Miss Parker," Patricia said as Madison entered her office, "please have a seat. I'm afraid we need to discuss some concerns that have been brought to our attention." Madison's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "What kind of concerns?" Patricia opened a thick file folder, thicker than Madison thought possible for someone who had only worked at Sterling Holdings for 6 weeks. "We've received reports of inappropriate workplace behavior. Nothing officially filed, you understand, but enough informal complaints to warrant an investigation." "Inappropriate behavior?" Madison repeated, though she already knew where this was heading. Specifically, allegations of unprofessional conduct with senior management. Patricia's tone was carefully neutral, but Madison caught the judgment underneath. Using personal relationships to gain career advancement, accepting gifts from supervisors, engaging in activities that could be construed as conflicts of interest. Madison felt the blood drain from her face. "Those allegations are completely false." "I'm sure they are," Patricia said, in a tone that suggested the opposite. "However, as I'm sure you understand, we take these matters very seriously. Sterling Holdings has a zero-tolerance policy regarding inappropriate workplace relationships. Then perhaps you should investigate the people making false accusations instead of presuming guilt," Madison replied, surprised by the steel in her own voice. Patricia's smile turned glacial. "Miss Parker, I'd suggest you be very careful about your tone. False accusation is a serious charge, and we have multiple sources expressing concern about your relationship with Mr. Kane." The word relationship was delivered like an accusation, and Madison realized she was being cornered by people who had already decided her guilt. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "For now, we're suspending your network access pending a full review. You'll continue to receive your salary, of course, but you won't be permitted to work on any sensitive projects until this matter is resolved." Madison stood, her hands clenched at her sides. How convenient that this investigation coincides with the most critical phase of the Los Angeles implementation. "The timing is unfortunate," Patricia agreed with mock sympathy, "but I'm sure you understand that the integrity of Sterling Holdings must come first." As Madison left the HR office, her mind raced with the implications of what had just happened. Someone had orchestrated this attack with surgical precision, timing it to maximize damage to both her career and the project she had worked so hard to save. She was walking toward the elevators, still processing the magnitude of her situation, when a familiar voice called her name. "Madison, wait." She turned to find Bryce Thornfield approaching, his expression a masterpiece of false concern. "I heard about the HR investigation. Such a shame. You showed such promise." The satisfaction in his voice was barely concealed, and Madison felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. "You did this." "I have no idea what you mean," Bryce replied smoothly, though I did feel obligated to share my observations when HR asked about office dynamics. "It's my responsibility to protect Sterling Holdings from potential scandals." "And what observations were those?" Bryce's smile was razor-sharp. "Private meetings behind closed doors. Special attention from senior management. Rapid career advancement that seemed disproportionate to actual qualifications." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "People notice things, Madison, and when patterns emerge, concerned employees feel compelled to speak up." Madison realized she was looking at the architect of her destruction, a man who had weaponized office gossip and turned her success into evidence of impropriety. "You couldn't destroy my analysis," she said quietly, "so you decided to destroy me instead." "I protected this company from a potential lawsuit," Bryce corrected. "Inappropriate workplace relationships create liability. I simply pointed out the obvious risks." The elevator arrived, and as Madison stepped inside, Bryce's voice followed her. "Perhaps next time you'll think twice before trying to play in leagues you don't understand." As the elevator descended, Madison felt something inside her break, not with despair but with a crystalline clarity that cut through all the corporate games and political maneuvering. She had been naive to think that competence and integrity would be enough to protect her in Alexander's world. But she wasn't naive anymore. Her phone buzzed with another anonymous text. "Still think your boyfriend can protect you? Check tomorrow's business news. Some secrets don't stay hidden." Madison stared at the message, her blood turning to ice. Whatever Bryce and his allies had planned, it was bigger than just her career. They were going after Alexander too. She rode the elevator to the 45th floor, knowing she was probably violating the terms of her suspension, but no longer caring about the rules that had never been designed to protect people like her anyway. Alexander's office door was closed, but through the glass wall she could see him on a phone call, his expression grim. When he noticed her standing outside, he immediately ended his conversation and opened the door. "Madison, what are you doing here? I heard about the HR investigation. They're coming for you next," she interrupted, stepping into his office and closing the door behind her. "Whatever they have planned, it's bigger than just destroying my career." Alexander's jaw tightened. "What did they tell you?" "Enough to know that Bryce Thornfield has been building a case against both of us, and tomorrow's business news is apparently going to reveal some kind of secret." For a moment, Alexander looked older than his 37 years. The weight of his position and the impossible situation they found themselves in, clearly taking its toll. "I should never have let this happen," he said quietly. "I should have transferred you to another department the moment I realized." "Realized what?" Alexander looked at her with eyes full of regret and something deeper, something that made her breath catch despite everything that was crumbling around them. "The moment I realized that you had become more important to me than my own empire." The admission hung in the air between them like a confession, beautiful and devastating all at once. And Madison realized that tomorrow, when the business world read whatever revelations Bryce had orchestrated, both of their careers might be over. But tonight, for just this moment, the truth was finally out in the open. The scandal broke at 6 in the morning with the subtlety of a nuclear explosion. Madison was in her tiny studio apartment in Brooklyn, nursing her second cup of coffee and trying to prepare mentally for what might be her last day at Sterling Holdings, when her phone started buzzing with calls from numbers she didn't recognize. By the time she managed to check the business news websites, the story was already trending on social media. Sterling Holdings, CEO in ethics scandal, billionaire Alexander Kane, accused of favoritism in controversial promotion. The article, published simultaneously in the Wall Street Journal and Forbes, painted a picture of corporate corruption that was both devastating and masterfully crafted. Anonymous sources detailed Madison's meteoric rise from intern to consultant, complete with leaked emails that had been taken completely out of context, and photos of her and Alexander in what the article described as intimate business meetings. The photo that accompanied the main article showed them on the roof garden during their conversation weeks ago, their body language suggesting a closeness that looked damning to anyone who didn't know the full context. Madison's stomach twisted as she realized how carefully this attack had been planned. Every interaction they'd had was being weaponized against them. Her phone rang again. This time, it was Vivian Cross. "Madison, don't come to the office today," Vivian said without preamble. "The building is surrounded by reporters, and Alexander wants you to stay away until we can figure out how to handle this." "Is he all right?" Madison asked, her heart clenching at the thought of Alexander facing this media storm alone. Vivian paused, and Madison could hear the strain in her usually composed voice. "He's handling it the way he handles everything. But this is different, Madison. The board called an emergency meeting for 9 o'clock. There's talk of a vote of no confidence." Madison felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Alexander could lose everything. His company, his reputation, his life's work because of her. "This is my fault." "No," Vivian said firmly. "This is Bryce Thornfield's fault. We know he's behind the leaks, but proving it is another matter entirely." After hanging up, Madison spent the morning pacing her small apartment like a caged animal, watching as the story spread across every major business publication. Conservative news outlets picked up the narrative about inappropriate workplace relationships and the corruption of corporate America. Liberal publications focused on powerful men exploiting young female employees. Everyone had an opinion, and none of them bothered to seek the truth. By noon, her phone was ringing constantly. Reporters, bloggers, even a producer from a daytime talk show wanting her to tell her side of the story. Madison ignored them all, but she couldn't ignore the text message that arrived at exactly 12:30. "Having second thoughts about playing in the big leagues? There's still time to disappear quietly. Keep fighting, and this gets much worse. A friend." Madison stared at the message, her hands shaking with a combination of fear and rage. They wanted her to run. They wanted her to slink away in shame, leaving Alexander to face the consequences alone. She was still staring at her phone when it rang with a call from an unknown Manhattan number. "Miss Parker? This is Harrison Whitmore." The chairman of Sterling Holdings board was calling her directly. Madison's heart stopped. "Mr. Whitmore, I need you to listen very carefully, he interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The board is meeting in 1 hour to discuss Alexander's future with the company. Your testimony could be crucial to the outcome. Madison's mouth went dry. My testimony? The allegations center on whether you received preferential treatment due to an inappropriate relationship with Mr. Kane. Your statement, under oath, with legal counsel present, could either support or refute those claims. You want me to testify against Alexander? I want you to tell the truth, Whitmore said carefully, whatever that truth might be. The question is whether you received your promotion based on merit or other considerations. Madison closed her eyes, understanding the impossible position she was being placed in. If she testified that her promotion was merit-based, she would be contradicting the narrative that had already been established. If she admitted to any personal relationship with Alexander, she would be confirming the accusations that could destroy his career. And if I refuse to testify, then the board will have to make their decision based on the evidence currently available, Whitmore replied, which I'm afraid does not look favorable for Mr. Kane. After hanging up, Madison sat in her tiny apartment, surrounded by the detritus of her ordinary life, student loan statements, a half-eaten sandwich, the business suit she had planned to wear to what might have been her last day at Sterling Holdings. Everything felt surreal, as if she were watching someone else's life implode on the evening news. Her laptop chimed with an incoming video call. Madison hesitated, then accepted the call to find Alexander's face filling her screen. He looked exhausted, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his gray eyes carrying a weight that made her heart ache. Are you all right? He asked immediately, and Madison almost laughed at the absurdity of him asking about her welfare when his entire world was collapsing. Am I all right, Alexander? You could lose everything because of me. Hey, he said softly, his voice cutting through all the noise and chaos of the past few hours. Look at me. Madison met his eyes through the screen, and for a moment, the distance between Brooklyn and Manhattan disappeared. None of this is your fault, Alexander said with quiet intensity. You didn't ask for any of this. You came to Sterling Holdings to do a job, and you did it better than anyone had a right to expect. Everything that's happening now is the result of people who can't stand to see competence and integrity succeed. The board wants me to testify, Madison said quietly. Alexander's expression didn't change, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. Resignation, perhaps, or acceptance. I know, he said. Whitmore called me too. The decision is yours, Madison. Whatever you choose, I'll understand. What would you do, if you were in my position? Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of everything they had shared and everything they stood to lose. I'd tell the truth, he said simply, whatever the consequences, because the truth is the only thing they can't take away from us. Madison stared at him through the pixelated video connection. This man who had somehow become the center of her world in the space of a few short weeks. She thought about her small apartment in Brooklyn, about her student loans, and her uncertain future. She thought about the corporate empire he had built and everything he stood to lose. And she thought about the truth, complex, beautiful, and potentially devastating truth about two people who had found something real in the middle of a world built on artifice and ambition. Alexander, she said quietly, there's something I need to tell you before I decide what to do. What is it? Madison took a deep breath, knowing that the words she was about to speak would change everything between them, regardless of what happened with the board or the media or the corporate war being waged around them. I'm in love with you, she said simply. Not with your money or your power or your position. With you, the man who notices how I take my coffee, who trusts me with impossible decisions, who sees me as more than just another employee fighting for scraps of recognition. Alexander's expression softened, and for a moment, Madison saw past the billionaire CEO to the man underneath, vulnerable, grateful, and unmistakably in love. Madison, he said quietly, I've been in love with you since the day you walked into my office and smiled at me like I was just a person worth thanking. They stared at each other through the screen, separated by miles and circumstances, but connected by something that felt stronger than all the forces trying to tear them apart. So what do we do now? Madison asked. Alexander's smile was sad and determined all at once. Now we face whatever comes next together, starting with the truth. The Sterling Holdings boardroom had never felt more like a courtroom than it did at 3 o'clock that afternoon. Madison sat at one end of the imposing mahogany table, flanked by two lawyers she had never met, but who had been assigned to represent her interests. Across from her, 15 board members sat in judgment, their faces ranging from openly hostile to carefully neutral. At the far end of the table, Alexander sat alone, his usual commanding presence diminished by the weight of accusations that threatened to destroy everything he had built. The media circus outside had been contained, barely, by Sterling Holdings' security team, but Madison could feel the weight of scrutiny pressing against the building's glass walls like a living thing. "Miss Parker," Chairman Whitmore began, his voice carrying the gravity of a judge pronouncing sentence, "you understand that your testimony today will be given under oath, and that perjury carries serious legal consequences." Madison nodded, her mouth dry despite the water glass that sat untouched before her. "I understand. Very well. Let's begin with the basic facts. You were hired as an intern at Sterling Holdings approximately 7 weeks ago. Is that correct?" "Yes. And within 6 weeks you were promoted to environmental consultant, a position that typically requires years of experience and advanced degrees. Is that also correct?" Madison felt the trap being laid with surgical precision. "Yes, but please limit your responses to yes or no for now," interrupted board member Constance Reed. "We'll have time for explanations later." For the next hour, Madison was walked through a timeline of her employment that, when stripped of context, painted a damning picture of rapid advancement that defied corporate logic. Every interaction with Alexander was dissected, every email scrutinized, every meeting analyzed for evidence of impropriety. "Miss Parker," said board member Catherine Vale, her tone sharp with disapproval, "during your tenure here, did you ever receive gifts from Mr. Kane?" Madison's heart clenched as she thought of the white orchid that had sat on her desk, a simple gesture of recognition that was now being transformed into evidence of corruption. "Yes," she admitted quietly. A murmur ran around the table. Constance Reed leaned forward. "What kind of gifts?" "A flower, an orchid, to congratulate me on my successful presentation to the board." "And did you consider this appropriate professional behavior?" Madison looked across the table at Alexander, whose gray eyes held a mixture of anguish and encouragement. She could lie, could minimize the gesture, could protect them both by denying the significance of that simple white orchid. Instead, she chose the truth. "No," Madison said clearly. "It wasn't appropriate professional behavior. It was personal. It was Mr. Kane acknowledging not just my work, but me as a person. And yes, it meant more to me than any professional recognition could have." The silence that followed was electric. Several board members exchanged meaningful glances, and Madison realized she had just given them exactly what they wanted, an admission that her relationship with Alexander had crossed professional boundaries. "Miss Parker," Whitmore said carefully, "are you admitting to an inappropriate personal relationship with Mr. Kane?" This was the moment of truth. Madison could feel 16 pairs of eyes fixed on her, could sense the reporters outside waiting for any scrap of information, could imagine the headlines that would follow regardless of what she said. She looked at Alexander one more time, drawing strength from the love she saw in his expression, and made her choice. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening in her chest. "I'm in love with Alexander Kane, and he's in love with me." The boardroom erupted. Several members began talking at once, voices raised in outrage and satisfaction. Constance Reed was practically beaming with vindication. Through it all, Alexander remained perfectly still, his eyes never leaving Madison's face. "However," Madison continued, raising her voice to cut through the chaos, "that doesn't change the fact that my promotion was based entirely on merit." "Miss Parker," Whitmore began. "No, you asked for the truth, and you're going to get all of it." Madison stood, her hands flat on the polished table, addressing the room with the same confidence she had shown during her original presentation. "I fell in love with a man who saw my potential before I saw it myself. A man who trusted me with billion-dollar decisions because he believed in my abilities, not because of any personal feelings between us." She turned to face Bryce Thornfield, who sat near the back of the room with barely concealed satisfaction. "The Los Angeles project analysis that I submitted was thorough, accurate, and has already saved this company hundreds of millions of dollars. The environmental partnerships I recommended are proceeding exactly as projected. The sustainable technologies I identified are performing above expectations." Madison's voice grew stronger with each word. "You can question my relationship with Alexander Kane, but you cannot question my competence." "Pretty words," Bryce said smoothly, "but the timeline speaks for itself. 6 weeks from intern to consultant doesn't happen without special influence. You're right, Madison agreed, surprising everyone in the room. It doesn't happen without special influence. The special influence of being willing to tell the truth when everyone else was too invested in the status quo to see the obvious problems with your original projections. Madison reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Before I came to Sterling Holdings, I spent 3 months researching this company and this industry. I read every environmental impact study published in the last 5 years. I analyzed the failures of similar projects across the country. I came here prepared to contribute from day one, not to serve coffee and make photocopies. She opened the folder and began placing documents on the table. These are my original research notes dated months before I ever walked through Sterling Holdings' doors. My analysis of the Los Angeles project wasn't a lucky guess. It was the culmination of years of preparation for exactly this kind of opportunity. The room fell silent as board members examined the documents. Madison could see doubt creeping into several faces as they realized the depth and sophistication of her preparation. Furthermore, Madison continued, I have emails from 3 independent environmental consulting firms confirming my analysis, firms that had no knowledge of my employment here or my personal circumstances, firms that reached the same conclusions I did about the risks and opportunities in sustainable luxury development. Board member Raymond Cross looked up from the documents with something approaching admiration. These projections are remarkably sophisticated for someone with limited professional experience. Because I don't have limited experience, Madison replied. I have different experience. I have the experience of someone who studied this industry from the outside, without the biases and assumptions that come from years of incremental thinking. She turned back to the full board, her green eyes blazing with conviction. Yes, I love Alexander Kane. Yes, our relationship has crossed professional boundaries. But my work speaks for itself, and my qualifications were earned long before I ever met him. Chairman Whitmore studied the documents for several long minutes, then looked up at Madison with an expression she couldn't quite read. Miss Parker, your preparation is indeed impressive, but that doesn't address the fundamental issue of workplace relationships and corporate governance. Sterling Holdings has policies. Sterling Holdings has policies designed to protect the company from liability and scandal, Alexander said quietly, speaking for the first time since the hearing began. His voice carried the weight of a man who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing to fear. But sometimes those policies protect us from the very things that could make us stronger. He stood, commanding the room's attention with the same natural authority that had made him one of the most powerful men in Manhattan. Madison Parker has done more for this company in 6 weeks than most employees do in 6 years. She identified critical flaws in a project that could have bankrupted us. She developed solutions that have already generated more positive press than we've received in the past decade. She brought fresh thinking to problems we didn't even know we had. Alexander's gray eyes moved around the table, meeting each board member's gaze in turn. And yes, I fell in love with her, not because she was young or beautiful or available, but because she challenged me to be better than I thought I could be, because she saw possibilities where I saw only obstacles, because she reminded me that business is supposed to be about building something meaningful, not just maximizing quarterly profits. The silence that followed was profound. Madison felt tears prick at her eyes as she listened to Alexander defend not just her competence, but the very foundation of what they had built together. The question before this board, Alexander continued, is whether Sterling Holdings is a company that punishes excellence because it comes in unexpected packages, or whether we're brave enough to embrace the kind of thinking that will define our future. Constance Reed cleared her throat. Mr. Kane, your eloquence aside, the fact remains that workplace relationships create liability. Then I resign, Alexander said simply. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Several board members gasped. Madison felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Alexander, no, she whispered. He turned to look at her, his expression gentle but determined. I won't let corporate politics destroy what you've accomplished. If my position is the obstacle to your success, then it's not a position worth holding. And in that moment, Madison realized that Alexander Kane was willing to sacrifice everything he had built, his empire, his legacy, his life's work, to protect her future. It was the most beautiful and devastating gesture of love she had ever witnessed. No. The single word cut through the stunned silence of the boardroom like a blade, and every head turned toward Madison as she stood with the kind of quiet authority that commanded absolute attention. No, Alexander, she repeated. her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill from her green eyes. "You don't get to sacrifice your life's work for me. Not today. Not ever." Alexander stared at her, confusion and admiration warring in his gray eyes. "Madison, I have something to say," she announced, turning to address the full board with the same fierce determination that had carried her through every challenge since arriving at Sterling Holdings. "And this time, you're going to listen to all of it." Chairman Whitmore opened his mouth to object, but something in Madison's expression made him settle back in his chair instead. "6 weeks ago, I walked into this building as an intern from Ohio with student loans and big dreams," Madison began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I had no connections, no trust fund, no safety net except my own determination to prove that merit still matters in corporate America." She moved around the table as she spoke, her presence filling the vast room in a way that made even the most powerful board members lean forward to listen. "You want to know the truth about my relationship with Alexander Kane? Here it is. I fell in love with a man who saw potential in my work before he ever looked twice at me as a woman. A man who challenged me to think bigger, work harder, and never settle for good enough when excellence was possible." Madison stopped directly in front of Bryce Thornfield, her gaze unflinching as she addressed the man who had orchestrated this entire attack. "But some of you can't accept that a young woman from a small town could possibly have earned her success on merit. It's easier to believe that I slept my way to the top than to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, I'm actually good at what I do." Bryce's face flushed red, but before he could respond, Madison continued. "So you manufactured a scandal. You took innocent interactions and twisted them into evidence of corruption. You leaked selective information to the press and painted me as a gold digger and Alexander as a predator. All because you couldn't stand the fact that my analysis exposed the flaws in your precious project." She turned back to the full board, her voice carrying the weight of truth that couldn't be denied. "But here's what you missed in all your careful scheming. The Los Angeles project is succeeding beyond our wildest projections. The environmental partnerships I recommended have generated over $50 million in positive publicity. 3 major hotel chains have already reached out about licensing our sustainable luxury protocols. The stock price has hit an all-time high." Madison pulled out her phone and placed it on the conference table. "That phone has been ringing all morning with calls from investors, journalists, and competitors who want to understand how Sterling Holdings became the leader in sustainable luxury development practically overnight." She looked around the room, meeting each board member's eyes in turn. "So you have a choice to make. You can destroy the 2 people responsible for your greatest success in a decade because you're uncomfortable with the fact that we fell in love. Or you can recognize that what we've built together, professionally and personally, is exactly the kind of innovative thinking that will define Sterling Holdings' future." The silence that followed was profound. Madison could feel Alexander's eyes on her, could sense the pride and amazement radiating from him even across the room. "Furthermore," Madison continued, "if you're concerned about liability from workplace relationships, I have a solution for you." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick document, placing it on the table in front of Chairman Whitmore. "That's my resignation from Sterling Holdings, effective immediately," Madison announced, "along with the founding documents for Parker Environmental Consulting, my new independent firm specializing in sustainable luxury development." The board members exchanged shocked glances. This was clearly not the outcome any of them had expected. "My first client," Madison continued with a slight smile, "will be Sterling Holdings, under an exclusive consulting contract that pays me exactly what I'm worth in the current market, which, according to my research, is approximately 3 times what I was making as an employee." Alexander's face broke into the first genuine smile she had seen from him all day. Around the table, several board members were struggling to hide their own admiration for her audacious solution. "Miss Parker," said Raymond Cross, barely concealing his amusement, "are you essentially blackmailing us into paying you more money to do the same job?" "I'm offering you the opportunity to retain the services of the person who just saved your company hundreds of millions of dollars," Madison corrected smoothly. "What you choose to do with that opportunity is entirely up to you." Constance Reed leaned forward, her expression calculating. "And Mr. Kane's position?" Madison's smile was radiant as she looked at Alexander. "Mr. Kane will continue to run Sterling Holdings exactly as he has for the past decade, brilliantly. The only difference is that now he'll be working with an external consultant who happens to love him, rather than an employee who happens to love him. The press will still have their scandal," Bryce said desperately, clearly grasping for any remaining ammunition. "The press will have a love story. Madison replied confidently. Two professionals who found each other while building something beautiful and sustainable and profitable. The kind of story that makes people want to invest in Sterling Holdings because they believe in its values. Chairman Whitmore studied the resignation document for several long minutes, then looked up at Madison with something approaching respect. Miss Parker, you realize you're essentially forcing us to fire you so that you can start your own company and immediately become our most expensive consultant? I'm giving you the chance to be part of a success story instead of a scandal, Madison corrected. The choice is yours. Another long silence filled the room as the board members processed the elegant solution she had presented. Finally, Whitmore called for a vote. All in favor of accepting Miss Parker's resignation and approving the consulting contract as presented. One by one, hands rose around the table. Even some of the members who had seemed most hostile to Madison were nodding their approval. When the count finished, 12 board members had voted in favor. Only 3, led by Bryce Thornfield, had opposed. Motion carries, Whitmore announced. Miss Parker, congratulations on your new business venture. Mr. Kane, congratulations on retaining your position and securing what appears to be a very talented consultant. As the board members filed out, Madison found herself alone with Alexander in the vast conference room. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. You incredible, brilliant, impossible woman, Alexander said softly, moving toward her with the kind of smile that made her heart skip beats. You just turned a corporate assassination into a business opportunity. I learned from the best, Madison replied, stepping into his arms without caring who might see them through the glass walls. Though I have to admit, starting my own company wasn't exactly how I planned to spend my Tuesday afternoon. Alexander's laugh was rich and genuine, the sound of a man who had just rediscovered joy after thinking he had lost everything. Parker Environmental Consulting. I like the sound of that. Alexander Kane's girlfriend, independent business owner Madison Parker, she mused, smiling up at him. I like the sound of that even better. When he kissed her, right there in the Sterling Holdings boardroom, with Manhattan spread out beyond the windows and their future stretching bright and unlimited before them, Madison realized that sometimes the best victories were the ones where everybody won. Well, almost everybody. As they broke apart, both breathless and laughing, Madison caught a glimpse of Bryce Thornfield through the conference room windows. He was gathering his things from his office down the hall, his expression grim as security personnel waited to escort him from the building. What will happen to him? Madison asked. Alexander's expression hardened slightly. The board investigation revealed that he leaked confidential information to the press and attempted to manipulate stock prices through selective disclosure. That's securities fraud. He'll be lucky if criminal charges are the worst of his problems. Madison nodded, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and pity for the man who had tried to destroy them both. No regrets? Alexander asked softly, his hands gentle on her face. Madison looked around the boardroom where she had just dismantled a conspiracy, resigned from her dream job, and started her own company, all in the space of an hour. She thought about her tiny apartment in Brooklyn, about the uncertain future of her new business, about the challenges that still lay ahead. Then she looked at Alexander Kane, the man who had been willing to sacrifice his empire for her happiness, and felt her heart fill with a certainty that surprised her with its intensity. None, she said simply. Not a single one. And as they walked out of Sterling Holdings together, equal partners in business and in love, Madison realized that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is follow your heart. Sometimes it's also the most rewarding. 18 months later, the morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Parker Environmental Consulting's Manhattan office, casting long golden rays across the conference table where Madison reviewed the quarterly reports that had become the backbone of her thriving business. At 25, she had built something that seemed impossible just 2 years ago, a consulting firm that had become the most sought-after name in sustainable luxury development. The irony wasn't lost on her that her office was located just 6 blocks from Sterling Holdings, close enough that she could see the building where everything had started when she looked north from her window. The Aspen project is exceeding projections by 40%, announced Leslie Chen, Madison's business partner and former environmental science professor from Ohio State. The client wants to discuss expanding the sustainable protocols to their entire resort chain. Madison smiled, remembering the nervous intern who had once trembled at the thought of presenting to a corporate board. Now she regularly turned down projects worth millions because her calendar was completely booked 18 months in advance. What about the Seattle development? Madison asked, reviewing the sustainability metrics that had become her signature. Ahead of schedule and under budget, Leslie replied with satisfaction. The developers are calling it the gold standard for urban eco-luxury. 3 other cities have reached out about similar projects. Through her office windows, Madison could see the hustle of Manhattan morning traffic, the endless stream of ambition and dreams that flowed through the city's steel and glass arteries. Sometimes she still couldn't believe this was her life, that the small-town girl from Ohio had not only survived in this world, but had carved out her own space within it. Her phone buzzed with a text that made her smile. "Lunch at noon? I have something important to discuss. AK." Even after all this time, Alexander's messages still made her heart skip a beat. Their relationship had evolved in ways that surprised them both. Deeper, more grounded, built on the foundation of mutual respect and shared ambition rather than just attraction. They had learned to navigate the complexities of loving someone whose world operated by different rules, and somehow made it work. "I need to step out for lunch," Madison told Leslie, gathering her things. "Can you handle the 3 o'clock call with the Portland investors?" "Of course. Though I have to ask, 18 months of lunch dates with Alexander Kane and you still get that look on your face when his name comes up?" Madison laughed, remembering when Leslie had first moved to New York to join her fledgling company. Her former professor had been skeptical about the billionaire boyfriend until she met Alexander, and realized that he looked at Madison the same way she looked at him, like they had found something rare and worth protecting. "Some things never get old," Madison replied, heading for the elevator. The restaurant Alexander had chosen was one of their favorites, a quiet bistro in Soho where they could talk without attracting attention from business journalists or society photographers. Madison found him waiting at their usual corner table, looking as perfectly composed as ever in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. But it was his smile when he saw her approaching that made her fall in love with him all over again. Genuine, warm, and completely focused on her, as if she were the only person in the world who mattered. "You look beautiful," he said, as she settled into the chair across from him, his gray eyes taking in her navy blazer and the confident way she carried herself now. "You look like you're plotting something," Madison replied, noting the barely contained excitement in his expression. "What's this important discussion about?" Alexander's smile deepened as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box that made Madison's breath catch in her throat. "It's about the fact that I've spent the last 18 months watching you build an empire with your bare hands," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same intensity that had captivated her from their first meeting. "It's about how you challenge me every day to be better than I thought I could be. It's about how you turned the worst scandal of my career into the beginning of the best chapter of my life." Madison's eyes filled with tears as she stared at the ring box, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone in the restaurant could hear it. "Madison Parker," Alexander continued, his voice soft but unwavering, "you walked into my world as an intern and somehow became the most important part of my life. Will you marry me?" The question hung in the air between them, beautiful and terrifying and absolutely perfect. Madison looked at this man who had seen her potential before she saw it herself, who had been willing to sacrifice everything to protect her dreams, who had become not just her lover but her equal partner in every way that mattered. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, with the confidence of a woman who had learned to claim her place in the world. "Yes, absolutely yes." As Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, a stunning emerald-cut diamond that caught the afternoon light like captured starfire, Madison realized that her journey from Ohio to Manhattan had led her to something she had never dared to dream about, a love that made her stronger, a career that fulfilled her, and a future that stretched bright and unlimited before them. "I love you," Alexander said simply, lifting her hand to his lips to kiss the ring that marked her as his. "I love you too," Madison replied, marveling at how those 3 words could contain so much: gratitude for the past, joy in the present, and hope for everything still to come. As they left the restaurant together, Madison's engagement ring sparkling in the Manhattan sunlight, she thought about the nervous intern who had walked into Sterling Holdings 20 months ago, with nothing but determination and student loans. That girl could never have imagined that her biggest risk would lead to her greatest reward. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is follow your heart. Sometimes it's also the most worthwhile. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it leads you to discover that the best love stories aren't about finding someone to complete you. They're about finding someone who inspires you to complete yourself, then choosing to build something beautiful together. Madison Parker had come to New York looking for a career. Instead, she had found her destiny. The end. Did you recognize yourself in Madison's journey? Have you ever taken a risk that changed your entire life? What would you do if you had to choose between love and career success? Would you have made the same choices Madison did? Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.